Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this whole class feedback presentation for your recent Year 11 history mock. So firstly, I want to say a big well done. I thought there were some fantastic answers in this exam, some great evidence and revision. I was particularly impressed with your work on Kenilworth Castle, which I thought was really good. Certainly showed that great work that you've been doing in class and that focus that you've done as part of your revision. The timing worked really well, so the vast majority of you completed all the questions in the time allowed, which was really good. In terms of things to improve on, just a bit more focus on explaining your opinion for question 4. At times we need a little bit more precise and detailed knowledge as well, so you need to think about that specific date or specific event or piece of statistical information, for example. You need to look at your exam technique for question 1, so looking at two aspects of the source to explain how convincing it is. Some of you were quite descriptive in your answers but didn't always use that evidence to link back closely to the actual source or the interpretation. And then we just need to make sure we hone our chronological understanding so that we know exactly when events happened during this time period, so that you are able to really focus on those questions around change and consequence. In terms of literacy, a little bit more analytical language, so phrases like this meant that, this shows that, this led to, this was important that. That's going to help you, particularly on the Kenilworth Castle question, to get the judgment marks towards the end. Use the extensometer to think about good analytical words, and make sure you've got some of those key spellings correct as well. Things like reticence or Catholicism, Protestant, those words, make sure that they're spelled correctly. In terms of next steps, we're going to be doing regular practice questions. You can revise your own knowledge using some of the retrieval quizzes that we'll be doing using Seneca, and we just need to keep that focus on Kenilworth Castle as well. But well done, great work. So let's have a look at question 1. Question 1 is the how convincing question. So I'll give you an interpretation, and in this case you have to say how convincing is interpretation A about Elizabeth's approach to religion throughout her reign. Explain your answer using interpretation A and your contextual knowledge. So here's a source about Elizabeth by the historian David Starkey. Now, there's an example of the mark scheme, but if you just look at in yellow at the bottom, basically what you have to do for this question is you need to use detailed and specific own knowledge to explain whether the interpretation is convincing or not and how convincing it is. You basically need to look at two aspects of the interpretation of the source. You need to quote from the source and be able to show and judge how convincing it actually is. Is it extremely convincing, very convincing, quite convincing, partially convincing, etc. You do not need an overall judgment for this question. So you're just looking at those two aspects of the interpretation. So if you have a look at the interpretation, one of the top tips is to highlight or underline when you're reading the exam question the two aspects of the source you really want to focus on, because one of the things that some of you were doing is just writing down what happened with religion in Elizabeth's reign without linking that back to the interpretation. So here's an example. You can see here the first bit that you could look at is what evidence have you got that to maybe support or contradict what Starkey says, that Elizabeth's behaviour shows how much she had learned from the debacle of Mary's reign. So what own knowledge have you got to talk about? Well, what was the debacle of Mary's reign? What was happening, and the issue of penalties there, her heresy laws, the burning at the stake of the Protestants during the reign of so-called Bloody Mary. And then the second bit would just be actually to look at Elizabeth's religious changes herself. So use your own knowledge to explain what the acts of supremacy and uniformity were. Is there evidence that there was a sliding scale of fines and punishments for people that did not follow the Catholic religion? Are there any bits that are missing which maybe make the source less convincing, for example? So that's the kind of thing you need to do. In terms of an example answer, this is an example answer. So you've got two paragraphs here. You notice in bold I've put there the phrase extremely convincing or quite convincing. So we've got that judgment in there that we need to get from the top level to try and get 8 out of 8 for this question. And we'll just look at that that first paragraph where it says interpretation A is extremely convincing when it says that Elizabeth had learned from the debacle of Mary's reign. And this is then when you bring in your own knowledge, your contextual knowledge. Mary's religious policies had been divisive due to the, quote, terrible penalties of burning around 300 Protestants at the stake for heresy, earning her the reputation of Bloody Mary. Elizabeth's middle way, compromise, and relative lenient punishment for Catholic recusants at the start of her reign shows this, although she did increase punishments after the Treason Act of 1571. So that gives you that good and specific own knowledge. You've got some very specific own knowledge there around how many Protestants were killed, the fact that we've got the Treason Act of 1571, and that is the kind of answer that you need for this question. So for question number 2, the question focuses on the importance of a particular event. So in this case, the question focuses on what was important about the fact that Elizabeth did not marry, and it's worth 8 marks. So for this question, you need to focus on at least 2 consequences for the fact that Elizabeth did not marry, and then use your own knowledge to give your opinion about its significance and how important it was. You really want to think, right, when you're doing this question, right, what are the 2 consequences? And then you want to think, right, what is the evidence I've got? But then also, crucially, to get the high levels, you need to think, why is that important? So you're not going to have time to do a plan like this in your answer, but this is the kind of thing you need to be thinking of. So I would say, well, one of the first things that's really important about the fact Elizabeth did not marry is it led to a succession crisis because there was no obvious heir to the throne. And then obviously you can talk about the fact that we've got the Stuart claim. And that's really important with Mary Queen of Scots, especially when she comes to England in 1568. But then we've also got the Suffolk claim as well with the Grey family, and probably less of a challenge to Elizabeth, but still you've got the potential that had Elizabeth died, particularly whilst Mary Queen of Scots was alive, then there would have been a real problem with a succession crisis and a potential civil war, and that's what makes it significant. Remember, Elizabeth nearly died in 1562 from smallpox, and if she had died, then that would have obviously been very, very significant. So here's an example answer, which you can pause this presentation and have a read of this. But you can see here you've got the 2 paragraphs. You're identifying 2 clear consequences about what was important about the fact that Elizabeth did not marry. I think what's crucial, though, is not just to describe your own knowledge and then put your own knowledge in there, but you need to use a phrase like, this was important because. So think about why it is significant. So that language there of analysis is really, really important for you to be successful on this response. So question number 3 is write an account of the impact that Mary Queen of Scots had on Elizabethan England, and it's worth 8 marks. So what you need to do is you need to think about 2 changes brought about this event by this event, and it can be helpful to think about different types of changes. So it might be for another type of question, social changes or economic changes or political changes. You might even want to think about it in terms of short-term changes or long-term changes. For this question, because it is all around change, it's really, really important to think about your chronological understanding and to make sure you know when events have happened. Now, we know that Mary Queen of Scots is a very important figure in Elizabethan England, and she comes to England in 1568, and then of course she is executed at Fotheringay Castle in February 1587. So she is a very, very significant and important person and has a huge impact. So let's have a look at some ideas for this question. So you really want to think about what are 2 different impacts that you can write about in terms of Mary Queen of Scots. So the first thing you could say is that her arrival inspired the Northern Rebellion. This would be your sort of short-term impact of Mary. So as soon as she arrives in 1568, it inspires this Northern Rebellion. And you can obviously read about some of the ideas and evidence that you would use to back that up. The second impact you could talk about is it led to Catholic plots. And we know that we had these Catholic plots to assassinate Elizabeth, and they are more longer-term factors. So I think Mary's presence in England created longer-term instability for Elizabeth, and obviously that led to her execution in 1587. And I think it's really important and really significant. You can judge her significance by saying that there are no Catholic plots before 1568 during Elizabeth's rule, and there's no Catholic plots after 1587. So that really underpins and reinforces how significant Mary Queen of Scots was, and what a destabilizing influence she was in England during this time. So you would write that out into an example answer, and that would be what you would need to do to be successful on this answer. So the last question is about Kenilworth Castle. And now this is a longer question. It's worth 16 marks. So it's really important that we have enough time on this question. So the question here says, Elizabeth's hand in marriage was the main reason for the remodelling of Kenilworth Castle. How far does a study of Kenilworth Castle support this statement? Explain your answer using your knowledge of Kenilworth Castle and your contextual knowledge. So in a nutshell, it's really important to know lots about Kenilworth Castle. So really thinking about the motivation of Leicester, Robert Dudley, and why he decided to remodel Kenilworth Castle is really, really crucial. So you need to find evidence to both agree and disagree with this interpretation using your knowledge. But then one of the things to really develop is that we've got to get that sustained judgment in. So we've got to make sure that we're putting a little bit more time and thought into our conclusions. And it's not just an afterthought that we're writing in the sort of last 2 minutes of the exam, but we're leaving ourselves enough time, because we probably need to go into quite a lot of depth on our conclusions to really get that level 4 response. Otherwise, you're probably going to end up being stuck in the level 3 and probably getting around a 10 or 11 out of 16. Whereas, with a little bit more fine tuning of your work and really getting that opinion in, you're going to get up to level 4 and get more marks. So there's some ideas here for evidence to agree, and there's lots of reasons to suggest that Elizabeth's hand in marriage is a main reason for the remodelling of Kenilworth Castle. After all, Leicester's building is built specifically for Elizabeth. The whole renovations are built around the princely pleasures and this 19-day progress in 1575. So there's lots of evidence for that, and of course there were rumours of a romance between the two. We know that Leicester was made, or Robert Dudley as he was then, Master of the Horse, that he was giving Kenilworth Castle, he was made the Earl of Leicester. So there's obviously a closeness between Elizabeth and Leicester, which therefore provides evidence that this may well have been about getting her hand in marriage. There is, however, lots of evidence to disagree. Some historians would say it was never a realistic possibility for the two to have got married because of the controversy around Amy Robsart, because of the controversy around Dudley's father, John Dudley, who'd been involved in the plot to install Lady Jane Grey. And of course, there's lots of evidence that actually this remodelling was just part of Robert Dudley's character, that he wanted to be this Renaissance man, that he wanted to preserve the legacy of his family and actually restore the reputation of his family as well. So there's lots of evidence which you can use to contradict this as well. We're very good at doing that in the answer, but what we need to develop is the conclusion. So in the conclusion, here's an example one that I've put together for you, and you can pause this and read this in your own time. But you need to be able to have a strong opinion. So you can see here straight away in this conclusion, in the final analysis, I would argue that the view that Kenilworth Castle was remodelled so that Leicester could win her hand in marriage is not at all convincing. So you've got that strong opinion, and then that's fully explained within that conclusion, and you're giving your own opinion. So in this case, we're talking about, actually, you know what, we see this just as a man that wanted to be this Renaissance figure, this very powerful nobleman, increase his family's reputation, and of course by having the Queen stay with him for 19 days, that would of course enhance his reputation anyway. So you've got to make sure you've got that strong opinion in your conclusion. So you're looking to expand the length of your conclusion, but get much more analysis and your opinion in there as well. Here's some words that you can use just to help you to make a judgment. So all of these phrases, maybe write them down and try and remember some of them, because these are all phrases where we start to use things like this was an influential reason, this resonates with the fact that, this was a standout factor, this was momentous, of considerable importance. They're all going to help you with making a judgment in that conclusion. And of course, it's good literacy as well, and it's going to help your writing skills generally. Here are some nice phrases as well, and you can pause this as well. But try and use some of these phrases if you are struggling to get that opinion in your conclusion. So things like, if you look down, although I would recognise there is some weight in this argument, I feel the overwhelming historical evidence contradicts this. My own view is that Kenilworth Castle was remodelled because. So you need to make sure you're getting that crucial phrases in there where you're really giving your opinion. The most important thing is not to just have an opinion where you're a bit wishy-washy and you say, well, there is evidence for it, but there's evidence against, so I can't really decide. You've got to have a strong opinion within that conclusion. Use the extentometer to help you, so that, again, when you're thinking about how far you agree or how important or what impact something is or how convincing things are, there's some great ideas there. And finally, what I would leave you with is this. You need to make sure you've got strong opinions in history. So do not sit on the fence. It's really important that you are giving your own opinion and you're able to give a strong judgment about what you think, because that's what history is all about. It's all about having your opinions, weighing up all the historical evidence that you've learned about, but being able to use that to come up with an opinion. It's not just about regurgitating that information in those exam questions. So make sure you use your opinion. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.